Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. This is going to be an interesting but strange episode, and here's why. I'm going to be peddling a conspiracy theory today. The end is going to be a conspiracy theory, but it's not a crackpot kind of theory. It's the one conspiracy theory that I believe genuinely has legs, even though it's supposedly been disproved. It's a conspiracy theory about who shot President John F. Kennedy. And the reason I'm telling it is because it happens to be the key part of the backstory for the biggest true lawyer crime story in the history of our country. And that is Watergate. At the end of the last episode, I teased that I was going to be talking about the biggest true lawyer crime scandal of all time in today's program, and that happens to be Watergate. It's a fascinating story that most people these days don't know. I mean, a lot of us have heard about it, but many of us don't really know the details. What's amazing about that story is how many sophisticated, high-powered lawyers did some really bad things. It's a great true lawyer crime story. But as I sat down to write the episode, I realized something. To truly understand what made the lawyers in Watergate think that they had the license to do what they did, you need to go back to the 1950s and learn about the Central Intelligence Agency. And when I started to look into the CIA's involvement to the circumstances leading up to Watergate, well, it led me to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. I know it's kind of tough to see how that's all put together, but if you give me a chance, you will see, and I think you'll find it fascinating. Now, there's one more thing to know. Today's story isn't about true lawyer crime. This is the amazing backstory to the true lawyer crime story of Watergate. That's why the Watergate story doesn't start with the lawyers who broke the law. It doesn't start with Richard Nixon. It doesn't even start in Washington, D.C. The story of Watergate starts in Central America. The students entered Mr. Hunt's office. Mr. Hunt probably had his nose buried in files, and he might not have heard the students come in the door. After all, there was always something that needed to be read. Memos, research, you name it. The students must have approached him slowly. They were surely tentative. After all, they had bad news to deliver. But the news these students would be giving to Mr. Hunt wasn't about school. It had nothing to do with grades or attendance or even classes. That's because Howard Hunt wasn't a professor or a teacher. Howard Hunt was a CIA operative. The year was 1949, and the group was meeting in E. Howard Hunt's office in Mexico. It was a turbulent time for the Central Intelligence Agency. They were struggling with making sense of the world in the aftermath of World War II. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they were sure of one thing. The Soviet Union was dangerous, and the Kremlin intended to spread communism throughout the world. That was something that E. Howard Hunt was dedicated to stopping. Howard Hunt was a cliché. Well, that's not true. He's a cliché today. It might be better to describe him as a prototype. It's true. Howard Hunt was the OG commie hunter. Hunt fought with U.S. forces during World War II, and during that conflict, he was a member of the Office of Strategic Services. That was the precursor to today's Central Intelligence Agency. When the war ended, Hunt stayed on, and he accepted a post for the CIA in Mexico. And it wasn't long until he heard the communists knocking on the door. Word on the street was that the Soviets were trying to make inroads in the nearby country of Guatemala. Nearby? Yeah, that was an understatement. Guatemala shares a border with Mexico. Mexico shares a border with the United States. And to die-hard commie haters like Howard Hunt, that's far too close for comfort. So, he decided to do a little recon. Hunt sent several students to Guatemala City to check things out. He paid their expenses and told them to get the lay of the land from the local religious leaders down there. They'd done so, and now it was their time to report back about what they'd found. It was not good news. The students told Hunt that the communists were indeed present in Guatemala. They spoke with local clergymen who recounted tales of beatings at the hands of communists. The students explained that communists were making inroads in the government of Guatemala's leader, Jacobo Arbenz. They explained that Stalinists were getting positions of power in the Arbenz government. Now, these anecdotes could have been nothing more than isolated incidents. But that's not how Howard Hunt saw it. To Howard Hunt and the CIA in the early 1950s, communists were hiding everywhere. To Hunt, the stories that these students brought back weren't one-off incidents. They were confirmation of something he already believed. They were evidence of a worrisome pattern. Hunt knew that Russia was spreading its evil throughout Europe, and as he suspected, they were now in the Americas. The question was, how is the United States going to handle it? Howard Hunt really did feel that the Guatemalan leader, Jacobo Arbenz, was letting the Soviet Union in the door to Central America. It wasn't some sort of witch hunt to him. He dispatched people he trusted to gather information, and he trusted the intelligence they provided. Plus, he knew that the Soviets were conquering most of Eastern Europe. Their expansionist approach to the world was real, and Hunt thought that the next frontier of the fight would be in his backyard. It was Howard Hunt's job to protect the United States homeland from infiltration by the enemy, and he believed that he was literally on the front lines of doing so. That is why Howard Hunt brought the situation to the attention of his superiors. Hunt knew something needed to be done, but he wasn't about to do it on his own. No, Howard Hunt was a dutiful soldier. He only took steps when they were authorized by his superiors. But once Hunt got the go-ahead, he pushed forward with relentless determination. So Howard Hunt needed marching orders, and that's why he started pestering people in Washington, D.C. He wanted the powers that be to give him the green light to do something about what he thought was a budding infestation of communists in Central America. Hunt shuttled between Mexico and D.C. periodically, taking meetings with politicians and military leaders. He was trying to convince people that they needed to do something with this Arbenz guy. The problem was, no one was biting. Now, don't get me wrong, no one in the United States government seems to have disagreed with Hunt. They all seem to have agreed that Arbenz was a problem for the United States. But was Arbenz such a big problem that his government needed to be toppled? That was where there was a difference of opinion. The decision makers in the United States government didn't consider the situation as dire as Hunt did. So, even though Howard Hunt believed that he sat at an important intersection of history, his superiors wouldn't give him the green light to move on Jacobo Arbenz. And because of that, the action that Howard Hunt wanted to take in Guatemala would never have happened. That is, if it weren't for bananas. If you were a child in the 1950s, you were probably pressured. You probably weren't pressured to do drugs. That wasn't really a big thing yet. You might not have even been pressured into sex. The sexual revolution was a few years off. But you were almost surely pressured into eating bananas. And the people that pressured you were probably from the United Fruit Company. Bananas was a big business for United Fruit. In massive ad campaigns, they promoted their Chiquita banana brand as a cheap, versatile, and wholesome food. They pitched them for everything from baby food to desserts. Bananas were pushed in cookbooks and magazine ads, even in school lunch programs. The place where United Fruit grew most of their bananas was the small Central American country of Guatemala. But they didn't just have some farms in Guatemala. United Fruit pretty much was Guatemala. The United Fruit Company was a massive American corporation that turned Guatemala into its own banana kingdom. The company controlled vast plantations, railroads, and even ports. They basically ran the country's economy like their own little personal fiefdom. But United Fruit's business suffered a terrible setback when Jacobo Arbenz came to power. President Arbenz wanted to nationalize the banana business. Arbenz threw a wrench into United Fruit's money-making machine by pushing a bold plan to take land from big companies like United Fruit and give it to landless peasants. His goal was to lift up Guatemala's poor. Obviously, this was a huge threat to United Fruit. The company needed someone to get Arbenz to call off this ridiculous nationalization garbage. So, they did what companies who are threatened normally do. They called their lawyers. And one of United Fruit's lawyers had an in Washington. That's because one of their former lawyers was actually in Washington. Allen Dulles was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. But before he was Allen Dulles, CIA director, he was Allen Dulles, lawyer at powerhouse law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. And that firm just happened to represent United Fruit. So when the United Fruit Company decided to demand that someone do something about this Jacobo Arbenz character, they had a sympathetic ear in the right place. United Fruit leaned hard on Washington to get Arbenz out. But the United States wasn't about to launch a war just for a fruit company's bottom line, no matter how much clout they had. But United Fruit's position was strengthened significantly when it was combined with Howard Hunt's lobbying efforts. Howard Hunt was already pushing the Eisenhower administration to intervene in Guatemala. Up until that point, they were reluctant to do so. But Allen Dulles knew that minds could change if he started to push United Fruit's case alongside Howard Hunt's case. Together, they might just be able to get what they both wanted. For his part, Howard Hunt didn't care at all about United Fruit. He couldn't care less about their plight. Howard Hunt was a soldier who was tasked with protecting the homeland, not protecting a company's profits. But if the cause of the corporation was the leverage he needed to get the chance to fight the communists in Central America, he'll take it. Together, Howard Hunt and United Fruit turned the tide. They convinced the Eisenhower administration to green-light a coup that would hopefully topple the government of Jacobo Arbenz. Opa-locka Airport is located in South Florida, about 15 miles north of Miami. It's a small commercial airport where you'll find private aircraft from Florida's jet set and the business planes from the state's corporate elite. But it wasn't always like that. During World War II and for years after the war, Opa-locka Airport was a naval air station. And the airport played an important, albeit silent, role in the history of the United States. Actually, it was only really one structure at the military installation that played that role. Building 67 at Opa-locka Naval Air Station was a daycare center. On any given day, you'd see uniformed personnel walking in and out of the building, dropping their kids off for the day. If you walked around back, you'd also see uniformed personnel walking in and out of the building, but they didn't have any kids with them. In fact, the people in uniform walking in the back door weren't even soldiers. You see, the front of Building 67 was a daycare center, but the back of Building 67 was the CIA's Black Ops field headquarters for the invasion of Guatemala. Howard Hunt split his time between two places when preparing for the invasion of Guatemala. He set up a small operations base in Honduras, strategically located near the border of Guatemala. But most of his important work would be done in Florida, in Building 67 at Opa-locka Naval Air Station. It was in that building that the CIA-supported invasion of Guatemala would be planned. And it was on that base that the participants in that invasion would be trained. Nearly every day, Howard Hunt's team were bringing secret flights into Opa-locka Air Station. They were the famous CIA black flights, the ones that don't exist on any register. The ones that ferry in people who don't exist. And those non-existent people, they weren't just coming in every day. They were coming in every moment of every day. Planes flew in around the clock, shuttling in members of the planned Guatemalan assault team. They were put up in the barracks in Building 67, they trained on the grounds of the Naval Air Station in Opa-locka, and then they were flown back down to Guatemala to wait for their orders. But Howard Hunt had far more to do than just training soldiers. He had a whole host of items he needed to complete in order to wage a successful operations. I'm not sure where one gets a checklist for the items needed to orchestrate a clandestine coup of a Latin American country, but Howard Hunt had one. And never having given much thought to the requirements for replacing a world leader by force myself, I can't imagine the types of items one would find on such a checklist. I certainly would not have thought that Howard Hunt would need the assortment of items and people that he set out to gather. But he sure did start to assemble a relatively curious bunch of assets. Hunt started by setting up a powerful radio station in Honduras right near Guatemala. He got the biggest transmitter he could find, and he set it up just over the border between the two countries. Hunt then worked on building his team. The soldiers he was training at Opa-locka were only part of the crew he'd need. He also added a newspaper guy. Well, he was actually a spy masquerading as a newspaper guy. Hunt knew a former spy who was now living in Chile, and he was recently engaged in, shall we say, contract work. The spy for hire was posing as a newspaper publisher in Santiago, and Hunt added him to the team. Once aboard, that man expanded the team by bringing on a group of exiled Guatemalan journalists who were currently living in Honduras and Mexico. Hunt then directed his attention to equipment. He went out and bought aircraft. Listen, you can't depose a leader without controlling the skies, right? Right. What was strange, however, was that the air power Hunt assembled didn't seem like it was enough to overthrow a country's military. Hunt's team purchased 2 P-47 Thunderbolts, which was a World War II-era fighter plane, and 4 light commercial-grade Cessna aircraft. I don't think you can call 6 planes, 4 of which are Cessnas, an Air Force. But it was what he got. The next item on the checklist were priests. Yeah, priests. A critical part of the coup would be getting the populace on board. The people of Guatemala would have to accept the leader that the CIA inserted. A coup's not going to take if the people don't agree with it. So, in order to ensure that the people were on board, the CIA had to start working the population before the actual invasion. That's where the priests came in. The CIA made a deal with local Guatemalan clergymen to have those priests go out to the countryside and get the CIA's message out to the people throughout the country. The message was that Arbenz had to go. That message was also carried by students. Hunt mobilized student groups who were loyal to the American cause to get the word out as well. Arbenz, they said, was corrupt. They planted stories that Arbenz was only out for himself and that he was betraying the Guatemalan people. Between the efforts of the priests and the efforts of the students, it wasn't long before there was a bubbling feeling within the Guatemalan citizenry that their leader, Jacobo Arbenz, needed to go. The Guatemalan people were being primed for regime change. The final element of the coup checklist might have been the most important. It was the element of installation. Deposing a country's leader is only one half of a coup. The other half is that you got to replace the president you're dumping. You need to actually install a new leader. The question for Hunt was, who would they get to replace Jacobo Arbenz? It was time for Howard Hunt to select Guatemala's next leader. Hunt's choice for the new president had to come from a group of exiled Guatemalans. Opposition leaders who were inside the country weren't going to help because they were dead. Well, they were either dead or incapacitated by Arbenz's secret police. Hunt basically had three people to choose from. His personal choice was a former Chief Justice of the Guatemalan Supreme Court who was currently living in Mexico. But the justice soon became unavailable. He went to a doctor to have something in his throat checked out. It turned out to be late-stage cancer, and he died. Next on the list was a very prominent former military figure. But the U.S. State Department nixed that candidate because they believed that he was a super far-right politician and there was little chance that the masses in Guatemala would support him. Probably a good move. When orchestrating a coup of a Central American country, it's probably a good rule of thumb not to place a murderous dictator into power. So, that came down to number 3, Colonel Castillo Armas. Living in refuge in Honduras at the time, Colonel Armas certainly looked the part. Howard Hunt described him as having the bronzed skin of a Mayan. And the backstory of Armas was a good one, too. He'd been imprisoned by the Arbenz government for a long time, and he escaped from jail by tunneling out of the prison with his bare hands. But maybe the most important thing that Armas had going for him was the fact that the other two guys Hunt wanted were not available. So, Colonel Armas, you're the next contestant. Howard Hunt sat in his operations headquarters in Opelika, Florida. The room felt less like a military planning center and more like a busy press room for a major metropolitan daily newspaper. Everyone was running around. They had sheets of paper in their hand. They were grabbing coffee and shouting at the room to one another over the din of typewriters. There was a crap ton of work to do and a lot of pressure to get it right, but it was okay because Hunt and his team had plenty of time to finish getting all the logistics for the invasion together. Until they didn't. On this one day, one of Howard Hunt's functionaries must have handed him a cable from the CIA Home Office. The information on that secure message would have made him quite concerned. CIA assets in Europe reported that a freight vessel from the Soviet puppet government in Poland was docked at a Polish port. The ship was being loaded with 50 tons of weapons, and the destination was Guatemala. It seems that Arbenz was going to use the weaponry provided by the communists to create and arm a personal militia. A well-armed militia would pose an incredible problem for the CIA's invasion team. Howard Hunt understood that the CIA had to move, and they had to move now. They needed to start and complete their invasion before that boat with munitions got to the Guatemalan shores. The invasion of Guatemala started from the air. Residents of Guatemala City were woken up on June 18, 1954, by the sounds of fighter planes overhead. The CIA's P-47s made low strafing runs over the city. Their munitions caused part of the city to be enveloped in smoke. The loud concussion of the explosives they dropped surely shattered windows and rattled the walls of the meager homes in the area. But then, that was it. There weren't any fires. There were no secondary explosions. And that's all because the CIA's ragtag Air Force of a couple of P-47s and light Cessna aircraft, they weren't dropping bombs. Well, they weren't dropping incendiary bombs. They were dropping smoke bombs. And the loud bangs that people heard, they weren't from munitions exploding. They were merely concussion grenades. The pilots of those fighter planes weren't trying to kill anyone. They just wanted to scare the crap out of them. And that was the point. Howard Hunt's plan was not to dominate the Guatemalan country with bullets and bombs. It was all going to be done with smoke and mirrors. The invading Air Force of a whopping 6 planes scared everyone enough to keep them in their homes. And while they were in those homes, they turned on the radio. And when that radio crackled to life, The news they got was delivered by a powerful radio transmitter that was just recently installed over the border in Honduras. And the news that came through the signal was not the official word of the government of Guatemala. It was the propaganda written by a team of journalists run by a spy for hire in Opelika, Florida. What the citizens of Guatemala heard on that radio was convincing. Jacobo Arbenz was corrupt. The invasion was underway. Arbenz was running scared, and if the Guatemalans tried to raise up in support of him, it might cause the United States military to get involved, and the consequences then would be damning. It was all garbage. None of it was actually happening. Jacobo Arbenz frantically tried to get out a competing narrative to tell the truth, but it was impossible. That's because the CIA's radio transmitter was so strong that it drowned out the Guatemalan government's radio signal. The only information anyone in Guatemala was getting was the information being broadcast by Howard Hunt. And what they were hearing was scary. And that was the point. Howard Hunt never intended to invade Guatemala militarily. The goal was to terrify the country and trick them into believing that they were being invaded. The campaign was designed to strike so much fear that it would render everyone paralyzed. And it was working. Those who were brave enough to venture outside their homes would have had those fears reinforced. The CIA's planes weren't just dropping smoke bombs. They were dropping leaflets as well. The propaganda team created carefully crafted text for those leaflets, which would reinforce the preferred narrative. Arbenz was bad. He was selling Guatemala out to the Soviet Union, a foreign power, and that should not be tolerated by the Guatemalan people. Howard Hunt was scaring the Guatemalans into submission. And it wasn't only the populace that got scared. The army was scared too. The Guatemalan army was confined to its barracks. There they listened to the radio like everyone else. They heard the news that Howard Hunt's team delivered. Jacobo Arbenz had fled, they said. Arbenz and his cabinet left the country high and dry. The soldiers must have felt that it was too late to do anything. If Arbenz was gone, there was no one to fight for. Plus, the soldiers didn't want to die in a fight with the Americans. So the Guatemalan army stayed put. Soon, the propaganda took hold throughout the country, and it became reality across Guatemala. Jacobo Arbenz lost the support of his countrymen, and he did flee Guatemala. Colonel Castillo Armas assumed control of the country. Howard Hunt's plan worked. A Central American country was not toppled by brawn, but by deceit. Not a single person was killed. Not a drop of blood was spilled. Not a bullet was fired. The CIA had changed the regime in Guatemala using nothing more than trickery. Years later, a journalist would call it a coup by radio. In 1954, the CIA was riding high on their Guatemalan triumph. The agency began to see itself as a master of the clandestine game. They'd toppled a government, installed their guy, and walked away with barely a scratch. They were the puppet masters. It was a heady moment, and for operatives like E. Howard Hunt, it felt like proof that they could bend history to their will. Guatemala became a blueprint, a covert playbook that they believed could be applied anywhere and at any time. But the CIA's confidence was about to slam into a brick wall. E. Howard Hunt went to bask in his glory. The agency reassigned him to Argentina, and he loved it there. As far as he was concerned, he'd be happy to stay in Argentina for the rest of his life. But that was not to be. Howard Hunt would be summoned back home to deal with an issue that was much closer to the mainland. In 1959, Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro threw out the country's existing dictator and seized power of the island nation. Castro turned Cuba into the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. This was a problem for the United States. The Eisenhower administration had no intention of allowing a communist country to be located only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It didn't take much convincing that something had to be done about it. And when the CIA was asked about the approach they recommended, they knew the answer. It was time for Guatemala 2.0. And if you're going to try to replicate the most successful operation in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency, you need the architect of that operation. And that's why E. Howard Hunt was pulled from his cushy new digs in Argentina and brought back home. Hunt went to Havana undercover to get the lay of the land. What he learned was that this was not and would not be Guatemala 2.0. Cuba was no Guatemala. Hunt realized very quickly that smoke and mirrors would not work. Cuba was a much larger body of land, there was a well-trained army, and Castro was beloved by millions of his countrymen. Hunt surely reported all of this to his superiors, but it didn't seem to make a lot of difference. A communist government so close to America had spooked the Eisenhower administration, and they were motivated to do something about it. And from the CIA's point of view, they were riding high. They figured that they had this in the bag. They'd done it before and not too long ago. Train a small force, slip them into the country, have the Cuban people rise up in support. Castro will be gone by breakfast. Howard Hunt did not share his agency's enthusiasm. He knew better. He knew it wouldn't be that easy. But Howard Hunt was a soldier who marched when ordered to do so. So whether the mission was a wise one, that was neither here nor there. He was ordered to put together a plan, and he did as he was told. When pressed, however, Hunt noted that a few things were necessary if the invasion was going to have any chance of success. The military landing had to be made at a particular point in Cuba, and it had to be done from the air. It had to be done by airborne troops. The other critical part of the mission to Hunt was that the United States needed to provide air power to protect the insurgent soldiers. It simply could not be pulled off without those two elements: attack from the air and protect those soldiers with U.S. air power. The CIA and the Eisenhower administration agreed to Hunt's requirements. After being given assurances that those key things would happen, Hunt was on board. He was given a safe house in Coconut Grove, Florida, and he got to working on planning the operation. Hunt was given a group of Cuban exiles who were eager to fight and reclaim their country. He and his team trained those exiles and put together an invasion plan that included those critical elements he outlined. Things were proceeding as planned. And then there was an election. In 1960, the young, idealistic John F. Kennedy was elected as President of the United States. He was a stark difference from the old guard of the Eisenhower administration. And no one would feel that more than the CIA. Because when Kennedy came to town, things changed. It became immediately apparent that Kennedy was not a fan of the Cuban operation. When he came to power, there was an eerie silence out of the White House when it came to that matter. Of course, that didn't stop the preparations. The Cuban exiles were in their training camps and they were doing what they had to do, but they were getting restless. As the silence continued, CIA operatives also started to get worried. Eventually, the Kennedy administration confirmed that the plan was a go, but they had some changes. John F. Kennedy was very concerned about how this would look on the world stage. He didn't want the United States to be involved so blatantly with the overthrow of Castro. He wanted the CIA to tone things down a little bit and to downplay the role of the United States. So they changed a few things. One thing in particular was an issue. The Kennedy team didn't want an audacious landing by paratroopers. Instead, they ordered a naval landing on a beach known as the Bay of Pigs. Howard Hunt knew that this was a mistake. The terrain of the Bay of Pigs was awful. It was a swampy coastline where it would be tough to establish a beachhead and even tougher to resupply. But the directive was clear. It would be the Bay of Pigs. The CIA could have recommended to pull the plug on the operation, and Kennedy probably would have said okay, but they didn't. By that time, the operation had taken on a life of its own. It had been in planning forever, a lot of people were invested in its success, and the momentum was moving forward. There was basically no way to stop it. So, despite their misgivings, Howard Hunt and the CIA pushed forward with the invasion. At least they still had that American air support, and that was going to be even more important now. The tough terrain of the Bay of Pigs meant that air cover would be essential. On the first day of the invasion, 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast. They faced immediate resistance from Castro's forces, and their disadvantage was instantly apparent. Just as Howard Hunt feared, Castro's troops pinned the brigade down in the swampy terrain. The exiles were overwhelmed. They suffered heavy casualties and had massive logistical failures. To make matters worse, the popular uprising that was the key to their success never materialized. President Kennedy was uneasy, to say the least. The world could see that the United States was involved in the operation, and it was something that he was desperate to avoid. The second day of the invasion didn't go any better. American air support helped a bit. United States aircraft strafed a Cuban airfield, damaging some of Castro's aircraft. But they didn't get them all. They flew all the way back to their bases in Miami and Honduras and Nicaragua to rearm, but then President Kennedy panicked. The mission was becoming a disaster, and the president was upset. He could smell defeat, and the idea that the United States would be found to have taken such a large role in the affair was going to be tremendously embarrassing. So Kennedy did the unthinkable. He ordered the air support to stand down. The American planes would not be providing any further air support for the insurgents. And that move sealed the fate for the insurgency. Troops were left unprotected. Ships were left vulnerable. It was a worst-case military scenario. On the third day of the invasion, unnamed CIA agents who planned the assault sat in a secure location in Washington, D.C. They were helpless. They knew that when President Kennedy pulled the air support for their comrades in arms, the entire mission was doomed, and they were about to witness their worst fears come true. That third day of the invasion had been agonizing. The commander of their Cuban insurgency had been radioing those men all day, begging for supplies. He was pleading for air cover. His forces were being run over, he explained. They were on the verge of collapse. And the CIA agents could do nothing to help. The furious, helpless men sat huddled around a radio. They were listening to the words of their Cuban commander, a man who had entrusted his safety and the safety of his forces with those very CIA operatives who were all listening to the radio that day. What began as a normal plea for help escalated drastically. The commander said that tanks from Castro's army were within sight. He shouted, "I have nothing left to fight with. I'm taking to the woods. I can't wait for you." That was the last transmission they received. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the CIA was livid. For many in the agency, the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation came down to one thing: John F. Kennedy. The risky operation would have succeeded, they felt, if Kennedy just wouldn't have pulled that air support. Of course, it's not fair to make such a simplistic conclusion. There were a ton of reasons why the operation failed, not the least of which was the hubris of the CIA in pretty much every aspect of the mission planning. But none of that mattered to the CIA. To them, Kennedy was the culprit, and the resentment was palpable. They felt betrayed. They were soldiers who were forced to leave their brethren on the battlefield to die. They listened to it happen on the radio. They listened to their men die in real time, and they were not permitted to do a thing. And the person who tied their hands that day was John F. Kennedy. What about Howard Hunt? Well, Howard Hunt didn't seem so up in arms. There didn't seem to be resentment with him. It was more like a "I told you so" moment. He came in to do a job. He told them what the limitations were. They didn't listen to him. The job didn't work. It didn't work because his hands were tied. If that's the way the politicians wanted it, so be it. Whatever. Now it's off to the next job. The rest of the CIA didn't deal with the Bay of Pigs so nonchalantly. The CIA would never forgive John F. Kennedy. And it seems that Kennedy felt it. Immediately after the Bay of Pigs failure, Kennedy started to look deeper into the Central Intelligence Agency. What he found was an agency that had grown into an institution that answered to no one. Howard Hunt and his exploits in Central America were only one part of the many CIA operations that took place in the 1950s. The stereotype of the undercover CIA agent that we all know today was born during that time. Under Eisenhower, they engaged in a ton of operations. They purchased and operated a commercial airline throughout Asia. For decades, no one knew that it was cover for their intelligence gathering operations. They organized a coup in Iran in 1953. They targeted communist-sympathizing world leaders with abandon. Kennedy learned that the CIA emerged as an entity that existed outside of the law. And the people in that agency with that power liked having that power. And when John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency, that's what he saw. And we know all of this because of Donald Trump. Documents revealed by the Trump administration in 2025 revealed that John F. Kennedy was alarmed by the power of the CIA. He learned that almost half of the political officers serving in the United States embassies around the world were CIA agents. His aides grew concerned because they believed that the CIA had more power than the State Department. Remember, the State Department is the arm of the government that is supposed to be directing U.S. foreign policy, not the CIA. A White House advisor actually warned President Kennedy about that in a report. He said sometimes the CIA mission chief has been in a country longer, has more money at his disposal, wields more influence, and is abler than the ambassador of that country. Often he has direct access to the local prime minister. Sometimes, he said, he pursues a different policy from that of the ambassador. When the dust settled after the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy was upset with himself. He could not believe that he actually allowed the CIA to proceed with that operation. He held CIA Director Allen Dulles personally responsible for the debacle, and Dulles was eventually fired. It was then and there that John F. Kennedy decided to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Advisors created 2 lengthy secret memos for the president, each of which detailed how the reorganization of the CIA could be accomplished. After lengthy debate, Kennedy decided not to smash the agency apart, but he did usurp their power considerably. He created a top-secret unit that would be in charge of all U.S. covert operations around the world. The chairman of that group was his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. But the handwriting was on the wall. During the rest of his term, there was a chance that he could disband the CIA altogether. His advisors were certainly pushing for that hard. A few months later, John F. Kennedy was dead. Now you tell me, who killed John F. Kennedy? You know what I think. You can tell from the way I set the story up. If you ask me, it was the CIA. That's the conspiracy theory that I was talking about. Now, I don't mean that the CIA pulled the trigger. I don't know about the one-shooter theory, about the second-shooter theory. There's a grassy knoll and a book depository. There was Lee Harvey Oswald, who was killed before anyone could actually talk to him. Surprise. I mean, for all I know, it could have been Professor Plum from the billiard room. I don't know who held the gun, who pulled the trigger, or where it came from. But however it happened and whomever actually fired the shots, I think it was orchestrated by the people who were most threatened by the president. And the people who were most threatened by John F. Kennedy were the angry, resentful, and powerful secret operatives of the CIA, an organization that lived outside the law. And it was an organization with people that were angry. In the eyes of the men of the CIA, President Kennedy forced noble, dedicated, patriotic warriors to watch their comrades literally die on the battlefield. And he forced them to sit there helpless. Could there be a bigger betrayal in the eyes of a soldier? And then, after that humiliation, he threatened to break them up and take away the massive power they had built over the last 15 years. You have to admit that theory has legs. But what about the investigation into his death? Why didn't the Warren Commission say the CIA did it? I'm not saying that there was a conspiracy at the Warren Commission. I think they reviewed all of the evidence that was available to them. And if the rogue agents in the CIA who orchestrated the death of the president didn't leave any evidence for them to review, then they could not have considered it credible. The Warren Commission made a conclusion based on the evidence they had. That's all they could do. And that's why the CIA argument can be considered nothing more than a conspiracy theory, because the evidence doesn't exist. By the way, I read something funny about that in the paper recently. There was an article in the paper that looked at the tranche of documents that was recently released by the Trump administration, and they searched for a connection between the CIA and the Kennedy assassination. The article said that there's nothing in those documents that confirmed a connection between the CIA and the killing of the president. No kidding. Did you think that this was something they would document? What did you expect to find in there? Did you think that rogue agents who illegally conspired to kill the president of the United States left a memo? You think they had a meeting where they created an agenda, took minutes, and voted on a resolution? Or maybe men who spent their entire career in the clandestine services would, I don't know, hide it? You're also not going to find evidence, because I don't think that the assassination was a coordinated effort by the agency itself. It wasn't the CIA officially who killed Kennedy. I think it was rogue agents within the agency who took it upon themselves to get the job done. And I don't think that Howard Hunt was among them. I don't think Howard Hunt had anything to do with Kennedy's assassination, and here's why. Howard Hunt was the prototypical dutiful soldier. He got his orders through the chain of command, and when he did, he followed them. If you read the interviews of him over the years, you can see that. He admitted it. He said he listens to orders. When you're that type of soldier, there are two angles to your loyalty. You don't question your orders, and you don't betray them. Howard Hunt didn't take his job personally. He was a professional. It's far more likely than Hunt would have felt disappointed with Kennedy, but not angry or humiliated. He probably would have aligned with the approach of Michael Corleone in The Godfather. You remember that famous line where Michael says to his brother Sonny, "It's not personal, Sonny. It's strictly business." Howard Hunt was a detached professional. It was strictly business. And that's why, even after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he stayed with the CIA for another decade. The dutiful soldier remained at his post. What's this got to do with Watergate? What's this got to do with good lawyers in Washington, D.C. who went bad and caused the greatest political scandal in the history of the country? Howard Hunt, the man behind the Guatemalan coup, the coordinator of the Bay of Pigs operation, was also the mastermind of Watergate. Richard Nixon, who was vice president under Eisenhower when the CIA became the all-powerful agency they became, basically reunited the old crew. And together, they took the approach the CIA used in fighting communists in the 1950s and applied it to a presidential election in the United States in the 1970s. That relationship is the answer to why Watergate happened. And that is what we will talk about on the next episode of Good Lawyers Gone Bad.